For 70 years, she held the same title. Kings stepped down, popes retired. Even her own husband walked away from public duty at 95. But she never did. Elizabeth II reigned until the very last day of her life. And the reason wasn't stubbornness, and it wasn't fear of losing power. It was a promise, one she made in 1953 and believed she could never break. Today, we're uncovering the real reason and the crisis, decades earlier, that made her that way. To understand why she never stepped down, we have to go back further than her coronation. Back to a decision someone else made, 16 years earlier. A decision that shaped the rest of her life before she'd even turned 10. There are 3 moments that explain everything. A crisis she witnessed as a child, a promise she made as a young princess, and an oath she swore before God in front of the entire world. In 1936, Elizabeth wasn't destined to become queen. Her uncle, Edward VIII, sat on the throne. Her father was just a prince, living a quieter royal life. Then everything changed. Edward had met Wallis Simpson years earlier at a house party, and by the time he became king, their relationship was no secret within royal circles. She'd already been divorced once and was in the process of divorcing a second husband. For the British establishment, that alone was almost unthinkable. The King of England was also the head of the Church of England, and the Church did not recognize divorce. Edward wanted to marry her anyway. The Church wouldn't allow it. The government wouldn't allow it. Even the press stayed silent on the affair for months, an almost unimaginable restraint by today's standards, until the story finally broke and the public learned what the political world already knew. So Edward did something no British monarch before him had ever done. He gave up the crown. He hadn't even been crowned yet. He stepped away before the ceremony, which meant, technically, he'd never fully taken on the sacred duties of the role. But the damage was already done. Historians still call it one of the greatest constitutional crises in modern British history. And the person who paid for it wasn't Edward. It was his younger brother, a man who never wanted to be king and suddenly found himself wearing the crown. He became George VI, Elizabeth's father. The pressure is widely believed to have taken a serious toll on his health. He died young, years before anyone expected, and Elizabeth watched all of it happen. She was just 10 years old when her uncle abdicated, old enough to watch her father struggle under a job he never wanted. People close to her would later say she understood, deeply, just how much damage an abdication could cause. Not just to a family, to an entire institution. That memory shaped her more than almost anything else. But it wasn't the only promise she made. There was another one, years before she ever expected to become queen at all. In 1947, on her 21st birthday, Princess Elizabeth gave a radio address to the entire Commonwealth. She was young, not yet queen, and no one expected the kind of statement she was about to make. She declared that her whole life, whether it turned out to be long or short, would be devoted to the service of the people she'd one day rule. At the time, it was just a moving speech from a young princess. But 5 years later, when her father died suddenly and she became queen far earlier than anyone expected, that promise took on an entirely new weight. She was no longer a hopeful princess. She was a monarch who had bound her entire future to that vow before she'd even sat on the throne. And this wasn't something she could quietly walk back. It had been broadcast to millions of people across the world. That was the personal promise. But there was one more, even more binding than the first two. And this one wasn't made to the public. It was made in a ceremony most people barely understand. On June 2nd, 1953, Elizabeth stood before the Archbishop of Canterbury inside Westminster Abbey. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a religious oath sworn before God in a country where the monarch also holds the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England. She was asked whether she was willing to govern her people according to their laws for the rest of her life. Her answer was, I am willing. That detail matters more than most people realize. Because in the eyes of the church, and in her own eyes, this wasn't a job she had accepted. Some historians compare it to a sacred lifelong duty, almost like a marriage. Some accounts even describe the coronation ring placed on her finger that day as a symbolic joining between the monarch and the nation itself. Walking away from that wouldn't have simply meant retiring. In her own framework of belief, it would have meant breaking a promise made directly to God. And there's one more layer to this. Unlike her uncle Edward, Elizabeth had already been crowned before this oath. Edward abdicated before his coronation, which meant he technically never took this exact vow. Elizabeth had, which meant, in her mind, stepping down was never something she and Edward could be compared on at all. It's worth noting that Britain stands apart from much of Europe on this. In the Netherlands, abdication is almost a tradition. Several Dutch monarchs have stepped down in old age to hand the throne to the next generation. But British monarchs, with only that one exception in 1936, have simply reigned until death. It's a different relationship between crown and duty, one Elizabeth inherited and never questioned. Put these three moments together, and the picture becomes clear. A childhood shaped by the damage of one abdication, a public vow made at 21, broadcast to millions, and a religious oath sworn before God at a coronation her uncle never lived to complete. For Elizabeth, stepping down was never simply about being tired or old or ready to rest. It was about whether she was willing to break three promises, each one heavier than the last. She never was. And that distinction matters, because scaling back isn't the same as stepping down. When Prince Philip retired from public duties in 2017 at 95, it wasn't framed as abandoning anything. He'd fulfilled his role as consort and quietly stepped back. Elizabeth followed a similar pattern in her final years, gradually handing more public engagements to Charles, William, and other family members. But there's a crucial difference between delegating duties and renouncing the crown itself. She could share the workload. She could not share or give away the vow she'd made. Even as her husband stepped back from public life, even as questions about her age, her health, grew louder in her final years, she held to those three promises until the very end. So here's the question worth sitting with. Was that unwavering sense of duty a strength that held an entire institution together? Or was it a promise that, in the end, cost her the freedom to simply rest? Let me know what you think in the comments below.